Welcome to a new podcast. My name's Rowan Reid. It's been a little while since the last one. We've done three, I think. Did sawmilling with David Jenkins when I was over in WA. I did a recording with my good friend Andrew Stewart, and we're talking about our work in the Otway Agroforestry network, particularly in his farming activities. And then there was Joskin Tibbetts talking about pruning, and do I need to apologise? They're three old white guys, and might me the same. And this one is one old white guy talking to themselves, so it's probably even worse. But we are looking at having a few other guests in the future, and the next session will actually be recorded in Melbourne at a live performance at Series Fairwood. So look up our socials and you'll see how you can come along to that free event. In that case, I'll be talking to Paul Haar, an architect, and we'll be sharing our own experience, both good and bad, about timber production and the future of timber, particularly in Victoria and Western Australia. Now native forest logging has been halted, and with a lot of people interested in stopping native forest in other states, well, I think it's become an issue now where we're going to get timber in the future. And Paul's done a lot of work on that, particularly looking at some of the imported timber that's replacing what's produced here. I think there's a lot of really interesting issues, and they reflect what I want to talk about today, which is my own experience, really. It's been 40 years this year, 2025. 40 years ago, I wrote a book with a journalist called Jeff Wilson, Agroforestry in Australia and New Zealand. At the time, in 1985, I was still working on my postgraduate agroforestry research. I was travelling the world and New Zealand, Australia, and just about head overseas, looking at how trees were being grown on farms, some of the agroforestry research happening around the world. And I reflect back on that book, and if I look at it, my thoughts haven't changed. Well, that's probably not a good thing to say in the modern era, but I reflect back on where I was back in those mid-80s. From 1985 to 1987 was the period that I was trying to explore where I was going to put my working life, where was I going to focus, and it all led to, some of you might be aware, purchasing this farm, Bamboo Agroforestry Farm, delivering the first agroforestry subject at an Australian university. That was in Melbourne University. I was an academic there, for almost 20 years or so. I left in 2010, but I still teach that subject that I started in 1991. And the development of the Australian Master Tree Grower Program. And I should also add the Otway Agroforestry Network, which you would have heard about in the podcast with Andrew Stewart. Now, all these activities reflect a philosophy or an approach that I had when I was in my 20s about, I mightn't have been able to articulate it very well then, and probably won't do so well again now in my 60s, for a different reason maybe. And the philosophy I had about how forestry had to change. And it really, to me, comes down to a couple of things. When I was studying forest science, and this is sort of how my thoughts were being framed, I spent my first 2 years up at Creswick at the Forestry School, then another 2 years finishing the degree at Melbourne University and Parkville in Melbourne. And during that period, my brother, just 15 months older than me, Tom, he was milking cows in the wettest part of the Otways, up above Apollo Bay. So I had on reflection, a really good mix of academic and involvement in practical and research and academic forestry. And on the weekends and holidays, I was milking cows and living in a small rural community. And I'm not sure how it occurred to me, but during that period, it was quite clear that the farmers and the community up there in Tanibrin on the ridge of the Otways didn't like forestry. The forestry that they saw, which was at that time quite large clearfell logging coops in the public native forest on the other ridge across from where the farms were, and the industrial pine plantations. And there were some companies at that time, timber companies, and less so than investors, purchasing farmland, converting it completely to Pinus radiata plantations. So the scenario there was, and this happened within a couple of farms of my brother's, what used to be a dairy farm, what used to be housing a family, got converted to a pine plantation completely. I'm not sure, I can't remember if the house was removed or not. But when you drove past farm after farm after farm, and then a deep, dark radiata pine plantation, then pop out the other side of farm, you can sort of appreciate, and I think I did, that forestry was seen as a threat and a competitive land use. And many of you know what's happened since then. We've had the managed investment schemes, we've had purchase of farms for lots of reasons, and now I would argue we've got carbon farms. Farms being purchased just to lock up carbon, and the same things happened. And my concerns back then about the way forestry was being presented, or how it was being undertaken within rural farming landscapes, family farming landscapes, hasn't changed. We still have seen wave after wave of similar activities over the years. So when I returned to forest science, which I'll make this distinction, forest practice and forest science. I am passionate about forest science. I learnt a lot and saw a lot about how forest science was being applied, particularly by government in native forest and by government in pine plantations, as it was back then in Australia. Largely they're privately owned now. And subsequently the industrial forestry era, through the application of science to grow, say, blue gums for wood chips, for example, in that case. Many people, when I say I'm a forest scientist, it has two different reactions. From one's perspective, my peers get frustrated because I think they think I'm discrediting the practice of forestry. And maybe I am. Maybe I'm concerned about the way we've practiced forestry in a rural family farming landscape. And I make that distinction. What happens in the green triangle in industrial forestry areas, that's less of a concern to me. But I have got concerns about the practice of forestry, and have had them right throughout my career, right back to the mid-80s. But I'm also passionate about the underpinning science and what it is. And what concerns me is that the wider community, farmers, let's say farmers, conservation groups, anyone with an interest in what's happening in practical forestry, tend to reject the science because they don't like the way it's been implemented or practiced in their landscapes or in their area of interest. And my concern is that there's nothing fundamentally wrong about the science. It goes back hundreds of years, simple science, how trees grow, how wood is formed, how trees interact between them. And science is really interesting. It's a moving feast, obviously. We're always learning new things that we can add to the bank of knowledge that we currently have. There seems to be, in the current era, is it social media or press release and clickbait, that we have different people coming out and saying new science proves that everything we knew about forestry was wrong. That really concerns me. That's clearly written by a sub-editor who's got no knowledge of the history of forest science, because everything changes in science, but it changes in minute ways and builds on past experience. And that's what I love about it. It's this moving feast. And if you're able to come up with, undertake an experiment, demonstrate something that hasn't been noticed before, and then you publish it, and people think that if something's peer-reviewed, then that's proof that it's right. Well, that's not the case. I've had published I've had papers published and they've been peer reviewed and published. And what you're doing when you do that, you're putting them up to a challenge. You're putting them into your scientific community and you're saying, this is what I did. This is the logic behind the experimental design. This is what I found out. This is what I think explains the results that I observed. And you may add to that an opinion if that's the case. Therefore, maybe that has implications to policy or practice down the track. That doesn't make it proof. That doesn't make it real. What makes it real is the time that follows. It's that other people read that, look at the logic, observe their own, review their own experiments and their knowledge and challenge it. Some people may even repeat the experiment using the methodology, and if they get a different result, well, there's an ongoing discussion about why that may be the case. So science is more than just publication, or particularly a lot more than just a press release. And if anyone says new science proves this, I get my hackles up quite a bit, because it's one step in the scientific chain. But what is true is that because this process of observation, testing of theories, application, repeating experiments has been going on for a long period of time, there is a foundation of knowledge in tree growing and science that we build on that's very hard to totally dismiss. You cannot have some new science that suddenly shows that trees grow backwards to the way we thought they did, or photosynthesis doesn't occur like that. These things have been tested over and over and over again. So we put them in the bag and say, okay, that's what we believe. This is how we understand them to go. It would be a huge step to disprove and change all that. And then we build on that over a period of time. And that's why I'm passionate about forest science, because I'm always learning, particularly now we're harvesting trees and wood and we're getting problems or we're getting good results or something. And I'm just always going back to the research. I'm looking at papers that have been published in the past around the country, around the world, saying what did they find, and then seeing how it relates to me. And maybe over time we can build up some knowledge and share that with other people through the process. So getting back to what I was in 1985 and 1987, I was passionate about the forest science I was learning about, but I was also passionate about family farming. And I think that comes from our family's history involved in farming, and the fact that driving around or flying over, particularly Australia, but right around the world, and I've travelled to many countries, the land degradation, biodiversity loss, the carbon that we used to not notice in the landscape, but now we're very interested in, all that degradation has occurred, well, let's say largely occurred, in the hands of family farmers. But that doesn't mean we dismiss family farming. I can't see another way that we can actually produce the food in all the diverse economies and landscapes and climates around the world without family farming. And I'm passionate about family farming being the vehicle for change. But we need to change, because the practices of family farming over in Australia 200 years, around the world much longer, has led to devastating results with regard to soil, water, carbon and biodiversity. So that's where the point is. Can the forest science, that knowledge that's been built up by many, many researchers, many countries, many observers, many practitioners over a long period of time, often with very little interest in family farming. They might have been researchers who are working to further government, forestry, or in public landscapes. They might have been dealing with industrial, but their research is also useful into exploring whether or not we can use forest science as a means of repairing the farming family landscape without taking the family farmers out of it. And that's where I was in the mid-80s. And it was at that point that Claire and I were actually in Africa, and I met up with my mother in Nairobi. She was visiting her cousin. Both of them had a long history in Australian farming. He worked in Nairobi as a lawyer. Mum actually told me then that she just sold the family farm that she part owned up at Walgett, and she made a comment that stuck with me that one night back in 1986 in Nairobi. She said, if I can give her a reason why I need farmland to further what I wanted to do with my career, she would back me. And I didn't ask her whether she'd back me if I wanted to buy a house in Fitzroy or something like that, but this was her focus. This was her interest. Keep some family money in family farming. Now, for a forest grower, and this is obviously the big challenge with trees, they take a long time. So to have the opportunity at 25 to say, what would I do if I had farmland owned by family? How would I use forest science to implement what I wanted to do? And this is the second part of why we did it, how would I present forestry to a farming community that I'd be living in? Not surprisingly, I came back to the Otways because I grew up down this area and my brother was farming in the wetter areas. But I chose not to buy land with high rainfall. You know, the sort of line that anyone can grow trees in high rainfall. And at the time, high rainfall or good rainfall for timber growing was considered to be over 1,000 millimetres. So I stepped it down and said, let's look at 750 millimetres or so, which is what this farm was supposed to be. But Andrew keeps telling me it's dropped by 10 or 15% since then. And having just experienced this current drought, which may have rained a bit yesterday, but we don't even know if we've got the break yet in late April, we are in a marginal landscape. So people say the Otways is wet. Well, it is. It's the wettest place in Victoria, but that's about 50 or 60 kilometres to the west. Just 15 kilometres to the north, east, that's where they grow wheat around Winchelsea. We're on that rain shadow side of the hills, and the rain just sometimes doesn't get over the ridge, so we can really suffer. So that was a purposeful decision. Some days I regret it, but it means that I'm challenged with heat waves and drought in the same way that many people in the medium rainfall areas of temperate Australia are. And we're always, I say always, every year at the threat of bushfires. Our family's had some history in bushfires. The Ash Wednesday 1983 fires, Tom was watching it from the top of the ridge glowing over the hills, but it didn't reach his farm. But a beach house that our family have had since the year I was born was burnt down. It was a place that I really treated as home. And not as a result of that experience and being a forester and learning academically about fire, fire's always been at the forefront of my mind. And it's clearly one of the reasons that forestry is seen as a threat to family farmers, because forests next door or on the property are seen as possibly, depending on how they're managed, increasing the fuel loads and the fire hazard. And that's true. But it doesn't mean we can't use the science to manipulate and design the plantings, whether it's species or management, that allows us to use the same trees or different species to reduce that fire risk. And that's something we really came into play here. So I picked a marginal rainfall. I also picked a marginal soil, and it's probably worse than I thought. This is sodic clay soils, very prone to erosion. We've been building a house here for 5 years, and I could publicly say I hate these soils. They get wet, they turn to mud, they go hard, they crack. When they're wet, they move, and movement is a real threat to drainage around house and pipes. Out on the farm, it caused problems, tree selection, trees blowing over because they can't grow in that. But again, it's meant that I've had to, if I had a perfect soil, every tree would grow. And now I've learnt so much about matching species to these particular problem soils. And so I'd put that down as a learning experience as well. So when people come here, I think some people say, oh, you're in the Otways, anyone can grow trees in the Otways. Well, this is not the Otways they're thinking of. And it's getting less so, and the heat waves are quite extraordinary. That's not to say we're the same as the Wimmera or north of Castlemaine or something like that. Every landscape's different, and this property, and this is how I envisaged when I set it up, is not a demonstration of what other farmers should do on their farm. And I've always said that, and I don't like it when people say Rowan Reid's got a demonstration farm. It suggests that I've got an answer and I'm presenting that answer to people. What I wanted to do was the opposite. I wanted to apply our forest science, my understanding of it, my understanding of the practices, adapt it and fit forestry in to our family farming landscape, match the soils, match the climate, match my particular interests and our aesthetic and my concerns about fire risk and soils and erosion and wanting to enhance biodiversity and those things. And I wanted then people to come and see that it looked different. It looked different to the forestry that they were familiar with, industrial, government plantations or public native forest. And I wanted to say to them, there's nothing new here. There's no new science. There's no new genetic material. There's no new wonder drug or fertilizer or herbicide that I'm using and that's going to change the way forestry is in the future. I've used the same science that others have used in the creation of their forest practices, but I've done it to reflect our interests and my enthusiasm for how forestry can be so much more than the way that it's been presented widely to the community. So it's not a demonstration of particular options, although people can obviously see species and they can consider pruning as a technique and I talk about thinning and stuff. But it's not about this is the right way to do forestry, you should apply it like this. It was, and to this end, I don't think I ever had a plan about what it would look like. So I just put the inputs in, my aspirations at any particular time, my knowledge of the site, what I wanted to achieve, put them in, and then let it express itself. And if people go away thinking, wow, I didn't know you could grow timber in riparian buffer strips, or I didn't know you could grow high quality timber in mixed species plantings that weren't in straight lines and things like that. Or I can see now that I don't need 10 hectares. I can actually, by selecting species and aiming at very high quality and products that don't require large volumes, I can produce timber even though I'm a small family farmer. And I can do it in a way that supports my current activities, enhances the farm, brings the wildlife back, or whatever their particular interests are. That's essentially what I was trying to achieve. And as a result of that, we have got a farm that looks different to most forestry. Some of those differences means that it's more expensive or labour intensive for me to manage. But the offset is that we find it really attractive, whether it's because of the biodiversity or simply the aesthetics. And I can't beat time, trees do take a long time to grow. But now that we've been here 38 years this year, it's we have got a body of experience about what is possible on a small farm. And our harvesting work now and building work of this house, I'm pretty passionate. Although there's a lot to learn, there's no easy way to do this. There's still a lot to learn. We can produce pretty high quality timber from farm grown trees, and it could be if hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of farmers did it, we could be producing a significant resource, particularly for a first world country. And I think this is where some of my peers are, I don't want to say stuck in the past, but there's this notion that we've gone through an industrial forestry era in Australia, and I was educated in that era. Pine plantations, we always talk about hectares of trees. You know, we need more land for trees. We want government subsidies to get more farmland converted to forest land because we need to produce this much timber for housing. It's a very tricky situation because as a first world country, our land, our farmland, is valued well in excess of its forestry production potential using conventional production means. And even if you're producing a high quality product and start looking at the economics, anything that takes more than 10, 15, 20 or 30 years to grow, it's going to be pretty hard to demonstrate how that can pay for that very high cost of land. So we need a different way of getting timber produced, and I suggest that a different type of timber may be produced or a different type of forest might be grown, and they've got to be, I just think if we've got a future of timber production in Australia, it's going to be tied to the fact that people want the trees. Now, I can see why my peers get frustrated with me. I've already pointed out that most farmers don't like trees, and I often say that forestry is ugly. Ugly as a neighbour, ugly as something on your property, ugly as an economic investment to many family farmers. People don't like that term ugly, but I think it expresses the fact that what we need to do is make forestry attractive to family farmers. They control 60% of the Australian landscape. Depending whether you look at leased land or privately freehold land. Around the country, the number is similar. You can certainly say that almost all the productive and arable land, a very high proportion of it, particularly in Australia, is owned and managed by family farmers. And if forestry can't be something that they want on their farm, there will be no forestry on those farms. And there'll continue to be competition between forest lands and agricultural lands. Now, I'm quite comfortable to have, as I said before, some areas dedicated to forestry, whether they be plantations or biodiversity or even carbon. But in the family farming landscape, I would like to see the ownership of those trees, or at least the land on which those trees are grown, to be by family farmers because of all those social implications of displacing, and also the fact that trees alone cannot pay for the land anymore. We as a community want more from our landscape than just timber or just food. We want aesthetics, we want residential, we want biodiversity, we want carbon, we want water quality. And when I say that list, it is quite clear that trees are part of that story. So if trees have to be part of the farming family landscape, I'm going to keep saying that, aren't I? Family farming landscape, then why couldn't they also be producing timber? So with those thoughts in mind, we set up the property and we planted trees from 1987 right through. We fenced out creeks, planted trees for conservation, managed them for profit. Many people have been here. Many people have seen our presentations. What I want to talk about more largely is this side about how we actually change the way we talk about forestry in the farming landscape so that we can engage 100,000, let's just many farmers in the tree growing activity. Now, Andrew and I spoke about this with regard to the Otway Agroforestry Network. But if we go back to that period in the 80s and 90s, it was quite clear that I needed, I don't know if I even told my mother this, but I needed some farmland because the way that forestry was being presented to the farming community was wrong. I'll say wrong because I can't use a stronger word. It was just say forestry on farms is just a small version of big forestry in a plantation.
Now, there's so much wrong with that. And can I use economics as an example? Let's say you've got the professional forest economist or researcher working in an office getting paid a salary, and he's asked to say, work out the best species and the most economical plantation design, the viable size of the plantation, where in the state those trees should be grown. And did I say where he's on it? He's got a salary, so he's got plenty of time to do this. And they do their desktop work and they go and do their field studies, and it's all very rational, good, practical, evaluation of the opportunities. Then they come up with the answer. And they say to farmers, you should be growing, back then it was pine trees, and more recently it was eucalypt plantations for chipwood, or there's always this, whatever the flavour of the economic opportunity is seen at the time. And they come out and say, well, if you apply this particular model of forestry, we can demonstrate this return on investment. And it makes me laugh because there's not many, and there is one or two, but there's very few foresters who have been advocates of that approach, who actually plant trees themselves, who are prepared to put family money, family land, and risk it for over a generation in order to get that commercial return. And they keep saying, well, this is the most economic model to use. Yeah, and I keep saying, but yeah, you're on a salary, you're using public money or investor money or something else, and you're telling a farmer that they should be doing it with their own money over that time frame, at that scale, that species, and it does make me laugh, because if I went to the farming community and presented forestry in that way, they would laugh. Because the risks are obvious, other than the fact you've got to wait so long. But in that process of waiting, you're exposing yourself to more and more risk. And maybe you're exposing yourself to opportunity. And I reflect on COVID being an opportunity because of the timber price impact. But almost always it's heightened risk. Risk of a fire, risk of a drought, risk of some political change, risk... And our neighbours are always pointing out this one to me. I wouldn't plant native trees because you get a koala and you won't be allowed to cut them down. I used to think, well, that'll never happen. But it almost is happening right now with regard to the vegetation protection laws in Victoria, which are starting to move into that notion. If you're planting Victorian native species and they seed and produce seedlings, and as those grow they get treated as native forest, and you can't touch them after 10 years. But that's a diversion. But it is an example of the fact that the way forestry and conservation are being presented to the farming community does not acknowledge what it means to be a landholder or a tree owner. And one of the greatest things we've learned from planting trees on our own farm is that owning land changes everything with regard to the way you approach tree growing. And I'm seeing it in our friends, David Jenkins, Andrew Stewart, and Jennifer, and many others. As their trees mature, and this is the interesting about families, we often say that families, they want their monies quickly because they're individuals, they want a return, and so there's a lot of interest in how can I get a commercial thinning operation, or how can I get this. But what I find is that people who've been planting trees for, say, 10, 15, 20 years, you get to a point where those trees are part of your farming landscape. It's not that you don't want to cut any of them down, but you want to cut them down when an opportunity comes to get a good outcome, and you want to only cut down some of them. So you're more inclined to do small gap logging or selective logging rather than a large clear fell. And that gets me back to the other approach that these foresters tend to want to focus on, and the reasons why the way people in my profession have thought about forestry makes it unattractive. See, I'm trying to soften the terms there rather than say ugly. Makes it unattractive to farmers. So first of all was that fact that they've got their economic tools but to work out how to deal with long rotations. But it doesn't deny the fact that if you plant trees for timber, you've got to wait. If you're waiting while being paid a salary to talk about forestry, well, that's very different if you're actually sitting there farming away, wondering what those trees over in the back paddock are, when am I going to cut them down? And if you think of it like that, that type of investor can't wait to cut their trees down, because the whole notion of the investment is I put money in, I'm growing it for a rotation, and then I'll harvest it and put the money in the bank. So you've got two groups of landholders, or forest growers, if you like. Those who are primarily focused on the investment and plant the trees and just can't wait to cut them down and cut them all down and turn it into money and call it, as they say, forestry is just another crop and I'm growing a rotation, compared to the family farmers. And because they're families, most landholders, and I know it doesn't work well, most of us as family farming landholders want to pass the farm on to the next generation, or even skip a generation, go to the next one. They tend to think in generations, and they tend to think that I want to enhance or improve the property in order to pass it on. And Andrew has always impressed me in this regard, talking about the fact that he's a fourth generation farmer and there's now 6 or 7 generations on the property, and he's got an opportunity in the 40 or 50 years he's got to manage this land to provide an opportunity for future generations. And he sees the economic return from trees as being part of that, which is fantastic. But with regard to long rotations, it may be I don't want to use the term rotation, because if a farmer has planted trees because they want trees for soil erosion, for biodiversity, and for aesthetic reasons, why would they cut them all down and go back to what the farm looked like when they first planted trees? It's like a nonsensical argument to say that growing trees is just like another crop. You grow, repeat, and I think that term's even been used by the industry. No, we don't want to repeat. We don't want to go back to what it was. We want timber production to be a tool in helping us take the landscape from one level to another level, and then when we do the harvest, to a higher level as well. And I'll use an example of our creek planting down here. When people come and see it, it was predominantly eucalypts for the first 10 years, and I did underplant and start enriching with rainforest species, largely from New South Wales because of the climate change issues. So just think of a landscape. If you saw it at 10 years old, prune trees along a creek, all eucalypts, you'd think, well, that's a rotation. Or grow the eucalypts for timber, cut them down, grow more eucalypts. It's a creek. I don't want to expose that creek to erosion again. I want to use the timber production as a means to hasten the succession to a rainforest. So as I take the eucalypts out, and the thing about eucalypts, they grow really well in full sunlight, but they don't like partial shade, and they certainly don't like sunlight coming from one direction because they're phototrophic. They'll bend towards the light. So when I harvest eucalypts and create a gap, I don't plant eucalypts. I've already got, or I enrich with, some species that have adapted to grow under the light levels of eucalypts, blackwood, she oaks, banksias, myrtle beech, not performing too well because of the drought, and other species that in the native forest context have their photosynthesis can be quite viable underneath the shade of a eucalypt, whereas a eucalypt photosynthesis is not viable unless there's full sunlight hitting it. So you have that distinction. But I've also got exotic species, not so much in the creek, but in other areas where I can plant oaks and redwoods under eucalypts, so that when I harvest the eucalypts, I'm actually leaving behind a forest which is going to the next level. It's creating a quality of timber or a quality of biodiversity or a quality of aesthetic which is higher and greater than it was even just before the harvest. So think of timber harvesting as a tool to take us to a higher level of aesthetics and environmental outcomes. That's what I'm really keen on doing. Now, in some cases, for the pines, for example, I'm looking up the hill, we could take out those. We have to generate quite a large gap in order to grow other things. So I might take out 20 or 30 trees in an area and then get rid of the slash, and then I can plant that area. But in some cases, I'm leaving it as a, the term glade, a gap in the forest. Once you get to a point where it's the negative space that actually looks quite attractive, and that has biodiversity values as well. Pasture production has declined dramatically under the pines and eucalypts, so it's probably that glade's not going to be very productive unless it's 100 metres across for pasture, but it certainly has a role to play in other aspects, and we can start introducing ground species or shrub species into that. But the point being that I was trained in a forestry that said you grow to get an economic return and the trees aren't worth anything until you harvest them and put them in the bank, which is fair enough because the public, forest couldn't deliver a return that wasn't related to the timber. Well, having said that, of course they could. They've delivered water, recreation values and others during that time. But the plantation sector never saw the non-timber values of their resource. And they spoke about a rotation. And those two things, I think, are very different and might be the first step when people are thinking, well, what forestry going to look like in a farming landscape? If we're not planting primarily to get a economic return, that sounds like I'm not interested in the economic return. I'm very interested in that. But for a family farm, 20, 30 years is so far away that it's not the same as going to get a job for a day. So you're really sort of making a decision about short-term cash versus long-term improvement. And the way I tend to look at that is, let's think about tree growing as not a source of income, but a source of, or a way of building capital. It's the same way you might renovate your house, renovate the kitchen in your house, maybe even build a new house. The key is once you do that, you don't get the full return of that until you actually sell the property. And many of us don't want to. But what we do, because of the way we built the kitchen, we get to enjoy it. And if we can grow trees on our farms a little bit like that, we can enhance the capital value of the property so the family feels like they're wealthier, even though they don't convert it to cash. But more importantly, that plantation or that forest or that timber growing enhances the lifestyle and meaning and enjoyment of the property the same way as cooking in a brand new kitchen that you've renovated might. So I was trained in forestry as a source of income, just another crop, grow, rotation, repeat. And it always occurred to me that is not going to work in the family farming landscape. Change some of those. What happens? We start talking about capital improvement. We start enjoying the landscape, worrying less about the return on investment and the volume per hectare, willing to compromise some of the commercial aspects whilst and because it enhances some of the non-commercial ones, which provide meaning and value to the forest on a day-to-day basis. And I think this explains why my friends Dave and Jennifer and others get to a point where they say, oh, I'm happy to wait another 10 years, another 30 years. The trees are growing. I'm enjoying the benefits. We don't need the money now. But if we do, it's like money in the bank. We can liquidate a few trees and as a result come up with a cash return. Then we're at that point now, then it's almost totally irrational from a forest economics perspective. We have people in our community who are willing to wait 30, 40, 50 years if their trees are providing immediate benefits, enhancing the property capital value, making shelter for the sheep, biodiversity improvement, all those things. If they're enjoying the trees, they're happy to wait. And there's one thing we do know about forestry and timber quality and harvesting costs and recovery of sawn timber and the value of a sawn board and all these other aspects, is that if you can wait longer and grow bigger trees, you'll have higher quality timber. I think the man in the street would know that. Almost every aspect of forestry in terms of its timber quality is enhanced by growing a longer rotation, other than probably chipwood because of the heartwood formation. And that's sort of exciting in a way, because the type of timber that a first world country wants is probably the sort of timber, a diversity of species, high quality, not just put behind the plasterboard, but put in front of your face, looking at our lining boards and window arcs and everything. That timber is better if it comes from larger trees. Now, what we've been doing with our silviculture, our tree management, is focusing on pruning and thinning, which allows us to grow fatter trees in the same time frame as what conventional plantations might do. So with the eucalypts, we've actually got a 100 centimetre diameter eucalypt this year in 37 years. We can grow the trees much quicker in diameter because we're focused on quality. And because we're focused on producing quality, I'm hoping the quality can justify single tree harvesting. So rather than do a clear fell operation, we can take out 10 single trees across an area to get a volume of timber, rather than take out 100 to 300 trees in one go using a big machine, because it's not economical to harvest small trees with a chainsaw and a tractor. But it seems to be economical to harvest big trees over 75, 80 centimetres and mill them on farm. We keep doing the figures, particularly when we're building the house. It seems to be viable, and it really depends obviously on how you put all those costs together and the capital costs of owning some of the equipment. But I don't think there's an argument that if we have time to grow trees, because we enjoy having trees on our farm and grow them for longer, and we produce a higher quality of log, whether that's diameter, pruning, growth rate, whatever, that it would be more viable to selectively harvest, or harvest in ways that do not threaten the reasons why we planted the trees. And all of a sudden these things are coming together, whereas say, okay, it's, my peers might say it's Mickey Mouse forestry, but it's small scale forestry becomes a viable first world activity, which is why I travel to North America and Europe so often. It's because I'm interested to see what sort of forestry might be appropriate to a first world country where land is worth far more than its productive potential, where there is community interest and concern about how land is being managed, where the off-site water, soil and biodiversity implications of forest management are being not only watched but are of interest to many people. And you start saying, well, what sort of forestry do we want? And my concern with many in the community who just see all forestry as bad is that they haven't really grasped the fact that forest science can be used to create enormous quality in terms of landscape value. They just haven't seen examples of it. And maybe that's what I was trying to achieve here. Now, this is no stunning example. It's not the only example of where that's it. But it's been a place where I can start expressing and exploring some of these ideas. And there is one other aspect about this property that occurred to me the other day, that it was very important to me in selecting a farm that we went to an area where I could say forestry, the community was hostile towards forestry. And, that's not fair to everyone in this community, but it's fair to say that farmers in this region, the broader Otway region, have protested against farms being purchased by industrial forestry. They've led protests against native forest logging in this region. So for a young forester coming in and saying, hey, we should plant more trees for timber, I had to be a bit humble and a bit cautious and start thinking, well, I'm not defending the type of forestry you don't like. I'm actually saying you haven't seen what forestry could be, how it could be done in a way that you do like it. And if we have succeeded, Andrew, I, David, Michael and others in this community, as we've explored this, I think, and I'd like people to come in and do some social research on this, I think there has been a community change. We even saw it from local government. They came out to our group and we showed them around a few farms and the councillors said, okay, we want to support your type of forestry, but we want to control the type of forestry you don't like. And to me, that was the first step. They could see that there were different types of forestry and that just putting a line on the map saying forestry is banned from this region is not going to help. In fact, it's actually going to make things worse. It would discourage farmers from planting trees in a region. And the same argument goes for the conservation side. If you start saying we've got to protect this landscape by telling farmers they're not allowed to harvest trees because harvesting trees for timber leads to a loss of biodiversity, we get those people out from those groups and we say, well, what if it was possible to harvest trees to enhance biodiversity and try to change that perspective totally around by doing that? I think we're getting somewhere in that regard. I think in our community, if you did run a survey, you'd tend to find that people are still concerned about big forestry, public forestry, but they're able to articulate that there are ways of doing forestry, incidentally, getting back to my first point, using the same science, producing timber for the same sort of markets, that is something that they're willing to support. And this is where I think we get to the crux of it. What do we need to do as a community, particularly what should government do and local government do to enhance the exploration and the development of forestry in the farming landscape that reflects the aspirations and interest of those people in that community? And they're highly diverse, and that's the key point. Farmers in this area, they're all different. So we all do different things with our tree growing. There is no right answer. There is no correct species or planting management. And that's what we've always encouraged. So in my mind, it's impossible for a top-down approach for government to say, we want to see this forestry in the landscape. We're going to give you a cost share grant to plant trees in some way. That has never worked. It has never worked around the world. Deciding what farmers should do, whether it's for Landcare or for timber production, and then giving them money if they choose to do what you want them to do, does not stimulate a culture of tree growing within a community, does not expand and develop forestry in the way that reflects community interests. It's just the wrong public investment. But there are so much other things that the public investment and dollar can be spent on with regard to having that conversation, supporting networking, supporting education, doing some research on timber quality, getting logs from different locations and milling them up and seeing what the timber's actually like, feeding it in to furniture makers and having an open mind to say, we don't know what the future of forestry will look like in this landscape, but if we don't do this work, we won't be able to have the type of forestry that we possibly want in the future. And that's a good way to tackle it now. With climate change, for example, we don't know what species is going to perform well, given the threats that are up against them. So let's plant a lot, try it out, do it on different sites. And all that activity on many, many different farms is feeding in, particularly through our farmer network, into improving the quality of the decisions we all make when we decide what to plant next year or how to manage our trees next year. And that is the key to building a culture. You invest in the travel, in the journey, rather than be fixated by believing you know where we need to get to. And most politicians have this notion, we need X hectares of trees because some lobbyist has told them we need this many trees to provide the scantling timber to build houses or something. I don't think that's the approach. I think we need to invest in the people who make the decisions about how land is managed, support them, give them the confidence to act, and then from that take it to the next step and see what comes of it. And I appreciate that's really hard for governments to do. They say, oh, we do all this education and activity. What if a tree doesn't get planted? Well, to my mind, if a tree doesn't get planted, it's because people still have concerns about whether forestry is appropriate to them, so more work needs to be done. It's much better than funding a tree in the ground and having landholders reject that in the future, which is largely what's happened around the world. But in this region, 30-something years ago, we started an experiment. We focused on building a culture of tree growing, exploring the opportunities, supporting landholders in what they wanted to do with trees. And we decided that we would not support or become a vehicle for providing grants for trees on farms. Because if a tree got planted, it would be what the farmers actually wanted. And of course, they started small, and that is a good thing. Starting small when you're entering into a new activity, and with tree growing, you can start very small. You can plant one seed, 10 trees, try a new species out. The same way I've done it here. When we started, I asked the question to myself, will red cedar actually grow here? I planted 6. Oh, they're doing all right. I planted more, and now I plant hundreds as a result. So starting small is actually a positive. The worst thing a new farmer can do is plant 3, 4, 5 hectares of trees, all on the advice of experts, and come to regret it. So that's what we've done in this area. It's an unusual experiment. I know nowhere else in the whole world that's done it, and it is hard for us to get government support for this because they love tree planting programs. But we show them what's happened in the landscape. We show them the social support that forestry has or seems to have within this region, certain types of forestry, I should add, and we say this is a worthy investment. We still don't know where it's taking us, but we feel like we're heading in the right direction. And to me, that's a bit of the story of the farm. That's where we came from. That's my career, and I guess I wanted to get it down in a podcast to explain where I'm coming from. It's been an exciting journey and often a frustrating one with regard to government policy. There has been change. We've got good support through our Regional Catchment Management Authority here now, who's focused on conservation, who see that it is okay to start talking to farmers about mixing conservation and profit together. We're having less success on with the production side with regard to conventional foresters seeing it's okay to compromise their net present value and their rotation concepts in order to enhance biodiversity and capital. But we are having some success and learning with timber users and processors who are starting to say, we don't know where our timber is going to come from in the future. Let's have a look at your timber and explore how we can improve the quality of it in the processing, and can we use it for different things. And as I sit here in a house, we've almost finished. 95% of the timber came from trees we planted. I've learned an enormous amount from about what the quality of this timber might be and what's involved in getting it from the tree into the final product, whether it has to leave the farm or can we do it all on farm, can we go through conventional kiln drying processes. It's all learning, and it's not all smooth. There are some setbacks, but I hope those setbacks and experience helps us build and share more knowledge with other farmers. So ultimately, they manage their trees better. And really, it's that investment that works. So I'll leave it at that and encourage you to come along And if you're in Melbourne, come along to Series next month and join in our live podcast with Paul Ha. And we'll talk about some of these issues and his experience and where the timber's actually coming from. But as a grounding for that, I wanted to explore my own background and my own interests and celebrate 40 years since Agroforestry in Australia and New Zealand came out. My first book, and I love writing and researching about trees on farms. That was done before we even had a farm, and as a result, obviously, our experiences changed dramatically. But if you've got that copy, there's 5,000 copies sold around Australia, so some of you will have it in your bookshelf. You'll see a curly-haired young 25-year-old in the photos. Things have changed, haven't they? They've changed for all of us in many ways. Thanks very much for listening, and if you haven't heard the previous podcast, go back and have a listen. Our YouTube site has some other stuff on it. Did a recent YouTube about our Nelda design and this whole discussion about are trees competing or are they complementing? And I'm in that discussion, short video, and I'll have a podcast on this one day. They're doing both, of course, they do both, and it's not a competition between do they compete or do they complement each other. And that's been frustrating if you look at the press as well about how they convey forestry. If we understand it's a bit of both, then we can see our role is to learn and understand and manage that competition and complementarity so that it plays out in a way that produces a higher value outcome for us. And the analogy, and I'll finish with this, the analogy I use, and I filmed this with a young guy, a kid in East Timor, rolling a bicycle tyre down a hill, or motorcycle tyre down a hill and tapping it with a stick. And it's rolling down and he's tapping it, he's taking it down the path. And to me, when I saw that, that's exactly what we're talking about. We don't need to throw more tyres off the top of the hill in the hope that some of those tyres produce good biodiversity, repair landscapes, produce timber. We need to have hundreds and hundreds of people with sticks, and that could be a chainsaw, a tool, any other tool that manages a forest, to run with their forest and take it in the direction they want to go. And the learning that we'll have and the knowledge and the culture that we will develop by having that investment in people will get the forests that we all want for biodiversity, water quality, carbon sequestration and timber, aesthetics and shelter. There are so many things forests can do. But don't focus on those. Focus on the people who will actually do it and own those trees and what support and guidance and confidence that those people need. Let's get away from cost share. Let's invest in people instead. Thanks very much, and I hope that was a useful podcast.